Hey everyone. I went through all the seasons from the show, including the spin-off, and now it's finally time for me to talk about how and where I would rank all of the seasons. Honestly, it was harder than I thought, since while my top few and my bottom few are pretty much established, the middle seasons I am going back and forth on, and as I'm writing and recording this, I am still not completely sure about it. All this is based on my opinion with how I feel about the cast, episodes, and the actions that take place in the season, and maybe some behind the scenes stuff that is clear to me. At dead last and 7th is Total Drama All Stars. So I know that this season was going to be last on my list from when I watched it all the way back in 2013, and that has not changed 8 years later, with 2 additional seasons being added, being removed from the show for several years, with me not following it at all, and watching it now as a grown man instead of a teenager like I did when it came out. That hasn't changed. The vibe was just off for me from the very beginning, but I initially thought I was overreacting, but things just got worse and worse as the season went on. I don't think the cast for the season was the worst, but there are a lot of fundamental flaws to it. 9 out of the 14 players played in one season before this one, where 7 of them only played in 13 episodes, and the other 2 only played in 26 episodes. This put the original cast in a disadvantage, where there were only 5 of them put in the season, and this cast was the one we got to see in about 78 to 80 episodes in comparison. Just due to this fact alone, we should have seen a lot more of the first cast. I'm not including Alejandro and Sierra, for the reasons I stated earlier. And we all know that Sam was a really poor choice. A lot of the cast were either completely dumbed down, not likable whatsoever, or too different without any explanation from the prior selves. Lindsay was dumbed down, Lanning and Joe were decent, Sam was pathetic, Heather was less endearing, Sierra was horrendous, Duncan was a shell of himself, Cameron sucked, Alejandro was a lesser Justin XB, Courtney was a mixed bag, I found Gwen to be shockingly unlikable, Scott was pathetic, Zoe was turned into a bad A double dollar signs to make it seem like she has personality, and Mike was wretched all the way around. And who thought a finale of Mike and Zoe was a good idea? It also felt like not a lot of the plot lines stuck, meaning that a lot of the season just felt worthless by the time you got to its end. Duncan and Gwen break up for reasons that are still confusing because it is so poorly executed. Gwen and Courtney become enemies again, though there was no indication that this would happen, and their friendship was awful to begin with. Scott and Courtney ended up breaking up randomly, though Scott apparently misses her in his final episode, and their relationship was kind of cringe at times. Duncan and Mal leading up to something was absolutely pointless since it led to nothing, and the ones that did stick were dumb. The idea of Mal was awful, and how they executed it in the finale is beyond abhorrent and offensive to me personally. Sierra seeing Cameron as Cody was something that should have never been greenlit. How Heather and Alejandro got together was pretty disappointing in my opinion. It seemed like there were a lot of half-baked ideas thrown against the wall to see what stuck. Due to this, a lot of the episodes just weren't very enjoyable. The humor fell flat a lot of the time. The season needed a larger cast, a season episode count longer than 13 episodes, and for it to happen once the second generation cast had more seasons to establish themselves as a cast. So, at number 6 is Total Drama Pahkitew Island. So, the other half of Season 5, I don't even want to get into how dumb this is, finds itself at 6, though a lot of people would have it at dead last, and I honestly don't blame them. I remember this coming out in 2014, and I wasn't pleased with the cast whatsoever since they looked so ridiculous. But when I watched the season, I chuckled here and there, and while a lot of them were still bad, there is still a fresh new take, and some of them were likable. And it's always nice to immerse in a new cast to get that fresh feeling and the new setting as well. While I did enjoy some of the episodes and characters, It was the season that stood out to me the most in how much the show derailed from its more grounded reality origins, which was why people fell in love with the show in the first place. And it had a lot of the same issues that All Stars did. Overall, the biggest fault with this season, even over All Stars, is the cast, and they are just horrible for the most part, and are more cartoony than those Saturday morning cartoons from the 1960s and 1970s. This is supposed to be a group of teenagers who represent archetypes that are generally associated with teenagers, and teenagers that you and all of us could see in real life. That's the whole premise of the show. A silent beatboxer, a LARPer who believes he's a wizard, a farm boy who can't even speak coherently when around a woman, a Disney princess wannabe, two evil geniuses, technically one of them's a wannabe, and a zombie conspirator. Even with some of those that are more realistic, have such horrid execution to their plot lines, like the twins, Topher, and Dave, to the point where even they don't come off as relatable at all. The next plot point has been an issue since Revenge of the Island, but the cast barely interacts with one another. A large part of this does have to do with the 13 episode format, but even the former cast does this a lot better with the same format. You have each member mainly interact with one or two other people throughout the entire season, to the point that by the time you get to the final 3 or 4, the cast barely knows one another and feels so separated from one another. For all of these reasons, it's hard to connect with the cast. I did find some of the episode challenges to be creative and kind of interesting, so they stepped it up in this element. I think, like All Stars, there are some interesting plotlines that were added, and while I think they are better executed here compared to the former, it is still very flawed. A lot of that has to do with the 13-person format, a lot of it has to do with the cast just not being good, and a lot of it has to do with poor execution, as well as having a poor boot order. Amy and Sammy should have lasted a lot longer, and the way their plot ended was too short, and very unsatisfying on both of their parts. Ella could have learned to grow into her own, or actually realize that Sugar disliked her, or they could have dragged out the Dave thing a bit longer, just so she could learn that life isn't a fairy tale. But both are cut short, so we could see Topher try to replace Chris for 8 episodes, and for Max to ramble on and insult Scarlett for 10 episodes. So at number 5 is Total Drama Action, and I don't know if this is going to shock people or not. So the first 26 episode season takes a hit here, and I actually remember really liking the season when it came out, but I was a preteen and an early teenager then, so I didn't understand much about storytelling, and the behind the scenes stuff about putting together a product, especially this season. When you look at a product or a narrative from beginning to the middle, to the end, this season connects the worst out of all of them, even compared to the 2 seasons ranked below it. Overall, it was clear that the show was initially made with the intention of being a one-off, so when a second season was greenlit, there was a lot of growing pains to stretch what was meant to be a one-off into a multi-season series. On paper, or at least with the people that were chosen, the cast is actually very good. All the people that merged, with the exception of Eva, returned this season, which makes sense since they were all the favorites that were on the cast, and generally were the people that everyone liked. They added 4 pre-mergers who showed promise in their first season and had potential to do more in another season, hence Justin, Beth, Courtney, and Harold being brought back. It was nice seeing them become more prominent in the season as characters, and even with the other characters that we saw a lot of in the first season, it was nice seeing other sides of them. Most of them were still very entertaining, but a lot of changes had to be made, which caused the flanderization and derailment that the show would be infamously known for. Jeff became a douche throughout the season. He and Bridget were annoyed with how much they made out. The less said about Trent, the better. Gwen started becoming a little bit less rootable here. Lashana became a bit more of a trash talker here, and Courtney's downward trajectory speaks for itself. Overall, it was interesting seeing how all of these characters were affected by their newfound fame, but the thing is, some of the changes were a bit too sudden, and it wasn't all tied together in a coherent narrative. Now to talk about the ongoing season. I like the ideas of them residing in the film law, and I like the theme of the challenges being based on genres, and I like how grounded the season is. It was before everything went too crazy in the following seasons, so the season was grounded in reality, and made it nice for me to get into as well. I mentioned it a few times, but the main issue with this season is that there is no strong narrative. The first quarter of the season mainly revolves around Gwent, and right when you think that's going to be a major plotline of the season, both of them are gone by the time the second quarter of the season starts. The second quarter really focuses more on Justin trying to be a villain with using Lindsay and Beth, Harold dealing with Duncan bullying Kim, and his relationship with Lashana. Lashana getting caught up in that reward challenge miss. The third quarter focuses on Courtney's ascension, Lashana still being caught up in her drama lie, and Lindsay being more smart and heroic. Where the last quarter now brings Owen back to be a rat, but now Duncan and Beth are giving more prominence. But following the season, you don't care about Beth or Duncan's journey due to this. Pacing is a huge issue with the season, since they have 26 episodes and a 14-15 player cast. This means that about half of the episodes had to be reward or aftermath episodes, where no one goes home, but even that wasn't enough. They had to bring Izzy and Owen back to pad things out, and both of them being pointless at the season, and Courtney being brought in midway. It throws off the pacing, and because they had so many episodes, so many things were thrown at the wall to see what would stick. It is more entertaining, charming, and realistic than the other two seasons, but it also shows some flaws with the 26 episode format. So, number 4 is Total Drama Revenge of the Island. I'm still debating as to whether this season should be 4th or 3rd, since it's a very tight race. When it was announced that there was going to be an all-new cast, I was initially annoyed about it, but then I was looking forward to it, since the first cast became exhausted, and the show needed something fresh to revive the franchise. And this season was very successful at doing that, especially with the ratings. The 13-episode format sucked in 2012, and it sucks today, almost 10 years later, but I think the format was used relatively well in this season, despite the natural flaws that comes from the format. Overall, the season had the essence of what made Total Drama great, but it also had some of the flaws as well, with some of those flaws being at its peak during this season. With any show, the cast is the most important thing, and when you are creating a new cast on an already established show, it is even more important, especially when that prior cast left such a huge impact and huge shoes to fill. The additions of Alejandro and Sierra in the last season showed that they were already looking to freshen things up and to slowly phase out the OGs, and I think the new cast was a pretty good cast, despite having a lot less time to get established. Most of the cast in the season are teenagers that you can and do see in real life. People like Bea, Sam, Brick, and Maria, Dakota, Joe, Scott, Zoe, Lightning, and Cameron do exist in high schools. Even with the over-exaggerated traits of some of the others, there are also people like Dawn, Mike, and Stacy that exist as teenagers. But you could also tell that they are somewhat struggling with not creating outright copies of some people from the original cast, and I think they did it fine enough. Everyone in the cast makes an impression on you, and they interact a lot more than the Pahkitew Island cast, so they do have a certain vibe amongst all of them. Most of them are entertaining, and while they are not developed much, which does really suck, you get something out of them and want to see more of them. I do think that if the cast had more time, they would have been as enjoyable and iconic as the first cast, but I can't go off potential, but what did happen. And now it's time to talk about the events of the season, and I think it could have been executed better. Scott's villainy and how he plotted certain people's demises are interesting, and he used a different strategy than the others, with throwing challenges. I do feel like he kind of faded after the merge, and I didn't like how his downfall happened. Mike and Zoe were better in this season, but I never cared much about their relationship, and it was hard to get into it. The triangle had potential to be interesting with Maria, and Mike lying to them both, but they don't even resolve it properly, so it didn't have a proper conclusion, and it just happened just to happen. I think Joe should have been the main villain, and I liked how she bounced off Brick and Lightning, with each conflict having a conclusion, and it entertained me more than the events of other plots. Lightning and Cameron was very shoehorned in, and should have been established and built up way before the last quarter of the season. Dakota and Sam was a more unique couple, and I like it, but the execution of it was not great, and Dakota's Zoid was awful. It actively ruined a lot of the season for me, and it just gave another example as to why the series went too far with the sadism and the over-the-top BS. Of course, the earlier boots didn't get much to do, but they're still entertaining, and a lot of the plot lines are fine, but needed more time to be executed properly. Overall, you get the feeling that everything in the season concluded fine after watching the finale, and it was the last time where there was an overall feel-good vibe to an end of the season. At number 3, I have Total Drama World Tour. Yes, I was, and still kind of am, thinking about putting the season at number 4, despite this being many people's favorite season, or the season that people claim to be the best. So I will say that it is an improvement over Total Drama Action, especially with coming up with a strong narrative from beginning to end, and the gameplay elements as well. But I also think that this was the season where the groundedness of the first 2 seasons started getting lost, and the sadism was becoming a bit too much, and things went way too dark. Despite that, there was still a lot of joy in the season, and everything was sped up in an exciting way, as well as some fresh additions that added some much needed spice to the group. I don't have an issue with the people that were put on the cast. That isn't an issue. Of course, they chose the favorites in Owen, Gwen, Heather, Duncan, Courtney, and other minor faves like Lashana, Izzy, DJ, Bridget, and Harold. They did the inverse of what happened in TDA, where they brought 4 guys who did not do well in TDI and were not in TDA, like Tyler, Ezekiel, Noah, and Cody, to compete. I do find it interesting that Katie, Sadie, and Eva were not given another chance. I could go on and on about the preferences for men on the show than women, but that is another video for another time. Alejandro, Sierra, and Blaney were much needed additions to keep things fresh in a cast dynamic that was starting to become stale, but they do come with a plethora of other problems as well. With 2 new characters, it is clear that they are not going to be early or even mid-season outs, so you know from the jump that they're going to be at the end. Also, Alejandro has to look impressive as a villain, so they dumbed down quite a few people to make him look even more intimidating, and while he is entertaining, it does cause for things to lack as much impact due to this. Overall, it is an enjoyable cast, but there is a definite sense of predictability and dumbing down people that doesn't elevate the season for me. Due to the fact that this season has the most structure of the earlier seasons, there's a concise story from beginning to end. Alejandro being the villain and Heather being the only one that is onto him was the story from the beginning to the end. Cody and Sierra was a cringe plot, but a plot that was the focus from beginning to end, though it has not aged well at all. Courtney, Duncan, and Gwen was hinted at from the beginning to the end, though the execution of that particular one was not great whatsoever. The destruction of Team Victory was a thing, which dampened the first half of the season for me, since it wasn't entertaining or funny at all, and I loathed what happened to Ezekiel, just showing that the show confused needless sadism for humor, as well as what happened to DJ. At the same time, there was a lot of potential for other storylines that they outright threw away, like Owen and Izzy's breakup, which should have been led up to throughout the season, instead of everything happening in one episode, and Noah feeling wary of Alejandro, only to be booted in the same episode. Even Lindsay and Tyler getting together was kind of half-baked in the season, and Cody eventually respecting Sierra was way too rushed as well. While I do give the season props for its linear storytelling, it also kind of works against it at times, since they're not able to execute several storylines, and in addition to all the cruel and over-the-top chaotic elements, like Alejandro being pummeled into the finale, Pharaoh's Zeke, and the exits getting more ridiculous, I am mixed overall, and it is somewhat of a front-loaded season. So at 2, I have Total Drama presents the Ridonculous Race. This season, technically this spin-off series, really shocked me. It was a completely different format based on The Amazing Race, and that show is mainly known for competitions, rather than strategy or dynamicism. So I didn't know how a cartoon could capture that, but get the feel-good elements that made Total Drama great, but they managed to do it. With it being a larger cast than literally every other iteration of Total Drama, and everyone being in pairs, a lot of the cast will not only be fodder with little development, but there will also be a lack of individualism with many of the pairs, especially with the ones who are booted throughout the first half of the season. There is a sense of realism that was removed from the franchise since the second season, since it was less about explosions, less about traumatizing and torturing the cast, and less about turning the cast into abnormal, unhuman freaks. There was just this feel-good vibe to the entire season, and it was a fresh return to form, while also having its drama and of course crazy moments as well. With a format like this, you really need to have a strong cast in order to pull it off, and they definitely have it here. But unlike most of the Total Drama franchise seasons, this cast is the largest ever, with 18 teams, meaning that there are 36 people in the season. A lot of the earlier boots, like the tennis rivals, geniuses, mother and daughter, step brothers, adversity twins, etc., are pretty forgettable in the grand scheme of things, despite having some great moments. And you can tell that they're going soon because they are unimportant for many episodes, but then suddenly get screen time when they're close to going home. But the final 9 teams each have their arcs, and it's well executed throughout the entire season. Dwayne and Junior of course learn how to communicate with and appreciate one another. Noah falls in love while Owen has to be the responsible hard worker. The Goths becoming fan favorites who are brutally cut while showing more vulnerability than anyone would actually expect. Emma and Kitty are distant at the start, but become closer to one another throughout the season. Jacques and Jose being the villains and getting their comeuppance. MacArthur and Sanders learning to respect one another despite not liking one another much in the beginning, as well as feuding with the Ice Dancers. Jeff and Brody didn't have much of a storyline, and I was a bit disappointed in that, though Brody did like MacArthur. Ryan and Stephanie, as well as Carrie and Devin, did have their storylines carried out from the beginning to the end, and there were some twists and turns, but it led to a predictable ending, and it did drag things out a bit too long. But I think due to the fact that it isn't a competition show that solely relies on social dynamics and strategy to determine who stays and who goes, is the main reason why I don't have it as number 1. And I also find it a bit more of a chore to watch the season in comparison to some of the others, despite it being a very great season. Maybe nostalgia partly plays a role in this, which I can't deny and say that it doesn't have a role in it. So at 1 is Total Drama Island. I am not one of those people who automatically think that the first of anything is the best, since most of the time it isn't. And I generally think that's a bad mentality to have. Since people are supposed to grow, people tend to know more about what they're doing after they finish the first thing that they're doing. But Total Drama, the first absolutely is the best. I have stated this before, and I'm going to state it again. You can tell that when this season was being developed, that it was intended to be a one-off experiment. There was a lot of heart put into it that simply isn't there for any future edition. And it really is a good spoof of 2000s competitive reality TV shows. And everything is so grounded. Almost everyone had their good moments, and they all were relatable humans, though you could like and take one thing from everyone in the cast. This season is the prime example of why casting is so important, and that you need people to relate to, which this cast definitely has a lot of people that fit under it. Most, if not all of the cast, are real-life teenagers that you and I have seen throughout our high schools and our communities throughout our lives, so it's easier to see their point of view and perspectives. It's something that the later seasons lost out on, especially the later generations. Even a lot of the father characters like Ezekiel, Eva, Noah, Justin, Katie, Tyler, Cody, Beth, and Sadie are relatively relatable, though none of them are very interesting, at least in this season. Of course, you had the more under-the-radar characters like Trent, Bridget, and DJ, who also have their several great moments in the season, and even earlier boots like Courtney and Harold offered a lot to the season. And of course, characters like Lindsay, Izzy, Jeff, Lashana, Duncan, Heather, Gwen, and Owen are iconic for many different reasons. Overall, a really great cast, and the reason why we all fell in love with the show in the first place. One disappointment about this season in comparison to the others is that the strategy was not heavily focused on, and I think it would have been a perfect season had they focused on that element more than just whenever Heather was on screen to do her BS villainy stuff, and occasionally Duncan and Courtney throughout the season. A lot of the boots from the late pre-merge, like the Cody and Beth boots especially, and throughout the early to mid-merge periods came off as way too contrived, especially eliminations like Trent's, Bridget's, DJ's, and Jeff's, as well as Lindsay's, of course. I can't believe I left that for last, and Lashana's too. We can't forget about Lashana's BS elimination. And it was clearly just ways to drag Heather to the end, since her social and strategic game were not strong enough to do it on its own. But you could overlook all of that because you cared for all the interactions throughout these groups of people who are very different from one another. The friendships were wholesome and relatable, the conflicts were interesting and fiery, the romantic connections were cute and shippable. So that is my list, and I'm sure there aren't too many surprises or anything revealing throughout this video. I'm probably going to talk about the TD relationships next, or rank the entire cast of the franchise next. Either way, it'll be fun for sure. Thank you all for watching this video and following this journey.